got to see the first part in this video series. Jerson and I were pretty excited when we brought this old dead Mercedes diesel home and got it running in 2 hours after the previous owner had said, the engine's dead. And you noticed in that video it wasn't running that well, but at least it was running. And in this video, I want to start talking about what we had to do to get it running. I asked, I put the question out there to all of you, what do you think it was? A lot of you thought it was filters, valve adjustments, and so on. And those were a lot of good answers. One thing I want to mention, when you're dealing with a 30 to 40-year-old diesel that has been neglected, hasn't been kept up on its maintenance, when you have an issue where suddenly the engine will not start, it's never just one thing. It's usually a multitude of things. And I brought out here on my table all the things that I used to get this engine running and some things we're going to use to even get it running better if it runs. And I want to point out, when you get one of these cars, I've heard this over and over again, customers have said, oh, Kent, I put new brakes on it, I put new shocks on it, I put new injectors in it, I put all this stuff on it, and they never tested the internal health of the engine. That's the first thing you want to do. You don't want to throw any money at these cars until you make sure the diesel engine is healthy internally. And that's going to be the first thing I'm going to do. And that's the first thing we did the other day. Now, to get a diesel to run properly, you need 4 things. Follow along here as I explain this. You're going to need air, intake air, and plenty of it. Okay, you're going to need compression, and a lot of it. On these engines, 400 PSI. It's a 20-to-1 compression ratio. It's almost 3 times the compression that you have on a gas engine. If the compression's weak, the engine won't start. So that's where we're going to start. Then you have to have fuel. You actually have to have fuel injecting into the cylinders at the proper time with the proper amount of fuel. And then fourth, you've got to have some heat. And that's supplied by the glow plugs. If the glow plugs are not working, they're not heating up the pre-chambers, the fuel will not ignite, and the engine will not start. So those are the 4 areas I'm going to focus on. In this video, part 2, I'm going to focus on intake air and compression. And then in part 3, the next video in this series, we'll take a look at fuel delivery and the pre-glow system. But I want to show you one thing. Every time I bring one of these home that won't start, there's one thing I do. It's the simplest thing you can do, but I do it with every diesel I've ever come across. Follow me to the back of the car. So what am I doing back here at this fuel door? Notice I call it a fuel door, not a gas door. That's going to give you a hint of what I'm going to talk about right now. I always come back, I open the fuel door, I pull the cap off, and I take a whiff. Do you know what I'm whiffing for? That's right, the smell of gasoline. You cannot believe how many diesels I've come across where gasoline was accidentally put in the tank. I've actually purchased 3 beautiful, pristine Mercedes. The owners were told the engine needed rebuilding, and all it was gas in the fuel tank. I smell down here now. This fuel smells pretty old. I'd probably change the fuel, but I just want to see if I can get this engine running before I do a lot of work. I'm not even going to change the fuel filters, because I know a lot of you said, oh, it's bad fuel filters. We'll just leave the fuel in the tank. We'll just leave the fuel filters. Let's see if we can get this baby to fire. Okay, I've got the hood in the air. Look at my hood support. The springs are missing. I have no idea why the springs are missing. I know some of you are saying, well, why don't you put the hood straight up? Well, the hood hinges are very rusty. They have not been lubricated, and I can't get it much higher than this. And I'm going to make sure that I do some good lubrication. You can break these hinges, by the way. We'll get these hinges lubricated later on in this series. You'll see the hood standing straight up. But number 1, we're going to go after intake air. And that normally is a bad air filter. I mean, you see this all the time. You pull the cover off. It's a bad, oily air filter that's restricting air intake. There's times when the turbo's not spinning, and that will restrict intake air. So when I do my initial troubleshooting on this, I just pull the whole air cleaner off. Look at this. The air filter housing mounts are broken. Anybody want to guess why they're broken? And anybody want to guess why they will probably break again in 2 or 3 months if I replace them now? So I'll just take and unhook everything. I think everything's pretty loose here. I'm not going to worry about junk getting into my intake here for this initial testing. If you are concerned, you can put a wire screen over that. But we'll take this off, and this will totally eliminate the possibility of any air intake restriction during our initial tests. Okay, look over here. You can see all three of those mounts are broken off. The bracket's not broken. That's really nice. And I should mention, there was one time I bought a turbo diesel that the owner could not get it to run over about 10 miles an hour. I bought the car cheap, brought it home, I pulled the air filter housing off to do this test, and there was a rag right here, a shop rag in the intake to the turbo. Can you believe that? I pulled a shop rag out and the engine ran beautifully. Now I'm going to reach in here right now and spin the turbo. Okay, we're just making sure that that's not binding up in there. That feels good. Even the turbo play doesn't feel bad in there. So I feel good about intake air at this point. Next thing will be to do a compression test. You're going to need a compression tester. Forget about doing anything else until you do this compression test. And I'm going to show you the results very quickly. I won't be going over this in detail as I have other instructional videos on how to do a complete compression test. But take a look. I think you're going to be surprised. We cleaned up the engine compartment a little bit. It was pretty dirty. I always do that just because it makes it easier to work on. But the owner said the engine just won't start. It's tired. He thinks the compression's bad. So we pull the injectors. First thing we're going to do is a compression test, which I feel is one of the most important things to do on an old diesel, particularly if you've just acquired it. We've already tested 5, 4, and 3. Now we're going to test number 2. Wow, 400. I mean, that's top of the line. So we had about 320 on number 5. We had close to 400 on number 4. We had 385 on number 3. And now we're looking at right around 400 on number 2. That is excellent compression. Now, there is a concern on number 5 back here, but it's high enough you're not going to have a problem getting this engine started. So let's go ahead and wrap this up with compression test on number 1. A couple things I want to point out when you're doing a compression test. Make sure you have a gauge that is working. Sometimes these gauges will be off or they will fail. The other thing is make sure you have a good sealing ring between the fitting and the inside of that pre-chamber. If it's leaking there, you're going to get low compression. So final test on number 1. Let's let it rip. Look at that, 400. Now this engine has over 300,000 miles on it. I've seen engines with less than 200,000 not have compression as high as this one on number 1, 2, 3, and 4. I almost forgot to mention something, and that's concerning these right here. These are the tools that you'll need to do a valve adjustment. And I always recommend doing a valve adjustment before you do the compression test because, hey, if your valves are too tight, you're going to be leaking compression by the valves, so the test will be invalid. So always do a valve adjustment. And why didn't I do a valve adjustment? Well, let me explain. The previous owner borrowed my tools and did a valve adjustment. Now, that doesn't mean the valve adjustment is 100% correct, but I'm going to just assume, for the sake of just trying to get the engine running, get it running reasonably well, I may come back and redo the valve adjustment. Particularly now that I know number 5 is a little low, I might want to check that out after I run this engine a while. One of the things that's important to remember, if you're dealing with an old diesel engine that's sat for a long time, you need to run it a while and then redo the compression. Because, you know, the rings are going to kind of reseat, the oil's going to seal up around those rings as the engine gets kind of run in again. So don't panic if you're doing a compression test from an old diesel that's been sitting until you've run it a while and then come back and redo it again. Just assume I already did a valve adjustment, okay? So we've got compression now. We've got 400 on 1, 2, 3, 4. We got about 300 to 325 on number 5. And that's very good compression. Obviously, number 5 is a little bit of concern because if you have one that far off, you may never get the engine to idle properly, but that's certainly good enough to run. I always tell people, if you get down around 300, you're going to probably be okay to get the engine started. If it drops below 300, around 280, it's going to be tough. If you get compression down to 250 psi, you have trouble. So if you do a compression test and it's really low on more than one cylinder, stop. Don't keep putting money. You see all this stuff here that I want to do to this engine. You know, here, for example, here's my compression tester. You're going to have to do a compression test, and you're going to have the proper compression tester to do it. And to do a valve adjustment, you're going to have the proper wrenches, which I supply on my website. So once you've determined that you've got good compression, you're ready to go. You know, I'll move on to the next step. And the next step is to go after fuel delivery and heat or glow system. So that's what I'll be covering in the next video.